Good evening. Welcome. Part of the Faculty of Architecture lecture series, we are pleased to have Heinrich Wolff, an architect from Cape Town, South Africa. He's in a practice with his wife Ilze as Wolff Architects, and the practice is developing an architecture of consequences through the mediums of design, advocacy, research, and documentation. Heinrich's work has been exhibited internationally, specifically at Venice Biennale in 2006, 2010, Sao Paulo Biennale 2005, 2007, South American Architecture Biennale in Ecuador 2008. He's also recipient of several awards, and specifically the RIBA Award, basically for his Red Location Museum of Struggle. And he is also guest professor at various institutes, Venice, Zurich, Washington University, St. Louis, and recently at Goa College of Architecture. He was an associate adjunct professor at the University of Cape Town and currently is an honorary research fellow at the same institution. He's going to speak to us basically on urban externalities, undoing inequality of the city. I welcome you, Heinrich, to take over and let us see.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. I can maybe just start off by some background to this theme of urban externalities. I developed this really for the module that I taught in Goa, and it was really kind of fluke, because I thought I would teach on something in South Africa because I don't know anything about India really, so I started reading a lot about India, and I discovered a few amazing similarities and some shocking similarities, like both India and South Africa struggles beating the price of US imported chicken. It's like we have that in common, but we also have in common the fact of inequality. South Africa being the most unequal society on earth, which is an unenviable title, but India, some say the second most unequal society, but the pace in growth of inequality in India is particularly disturbing. So I thought that that is something that maybe I could speak about, because in that sense I bring a message from a very bad place. And I'm saying to you is, do not go where South Africa has gone. There is no future. It's a dark side, and maybe I could begin to explain how bad it is and why it is so bad and why it is probably the crime of our times. I was explaining as a Afrikaans man who was the beneficiary of privileges during apartheid, of German descent, who my ancestors remember the trauma of the Second World War. And this question about complicity is always there. How do people live at times when really great crimes go down and do nothing? How is that? And we can talk about that for long, but in short I can just tell you is that I think that inequality and the production and increase in inequality today is that crime of our time. We are witness to this, and we see the suffering. It's not that we don't see it. It's not that we don't know where it is. We see it every day, and somehow we think it's not so bad. I was talking about this image of Jews being rounded up for a concentration camp, and people think somehow it's not going to be so bad. It won't get worse. We know it's getting worse. I mean, it's increasing in India. Is 58% of your wealth is owned by 8 individuals, right? So it is a very bad situation. It's getting worse. Now, what makes it an interesting topic for us to think through seriously is that architects are fundamental in supporting the growth of inequality, particularly in the city. Is that we are not innocent bystanders. So architects have participated in imagining new configurations of the city which assist the operation of contemporary capitalism. So certain types of economic impulse could not be realized without the city morphology allowing and facilitating it. Therefore, if we are concerned with growing inequality, we should be concerned about the new urban formations which assist the monopolization of economic opportunity on the one hand, and marginalization of people in conditions of unfreedom on the other hand. So I will show you drawings later where we try to visualize how architects and urban designers are doing it, because we can talk about how big business does it or economic regulations do it and so on. But all of this would be substantially frustrated if architects had to resist it. And we don't, and I think we don't fully understand how bad the problem is. So it's like we've just discovered air pollution, or we just discovered that smoking causes cancer, and we are just about to start doing something about it. So let me just talk about this title of externalities, because some people think that I'm talking about something on the outside of the city or on the outside of buildings. It's not about that at all. Externalities is a concept of economics that talks about a consequence that a transaction has on a party not participating in the transaction. So party A makes a product, party B buys it, and parties C, D, E, and F suffer consequences because of this transaction. So it's a well-known fact since 1850s that if such an unintended consequence occurs in a transaction, that consequence must be monetized and factored back into the transaction. So the classic example is air pollution. A factory makes shoes, people buy shoes, but the factory pollutes the environment. So the society understands that pollution as a negative externality and then regulates against it to either say you may not do it, or if there's a certain kind of a pollution, they make people pay. It's like sin tax on smoking. I don't know if you have that in India. But in South Africa we have a sin tax on smoking, which says the government pays the consequences for people smoking. So the cigarette company gets money for it. They get money for cigarettes, people smoke, but then the government has to pay, or the citizens have to pay for public health care. So they put a sin tax on it, which is equivalent to the cost of public health care on cigarettes. It's a very simple calculation, but saying is that there's a consequence and the consumer of cigarettes must pay for it. So my argument simply is that in urban development, there are major negative consequences to certain kinds of urban development. And as it stands at the moment, people are getting away with it. So they are, metaphorically speaking, polluting the air, and we're not doing anything about it. So the city structure is weakened, and we're not doing anything about it because we don't fully understand how negative it is. But what's interesting in the economics, the debate in economics about externalities is you get negative externalities like air pollution, or you get positive externalities. Now, positive externalities are also called network systems. Now, the classic example of a positive externality is the telephone. So you make a telephone and you sell it to one person. It's a completely useless purchase and a device. You sell it to two people, it gets sort of amusing, but no real benefit. You sell it to everybody on earth, and you change human beings by the fact that this technology exists. So in other words, the benefits are exponentially greater than the transaction, what it does for people. So what is interesting is that there's again, a term that sounds like it's almost about the city, and this postulation that the right kind of a product operating in just the right kind of way can transform the lives of people and society as a whole. So we are in search of positive externalities. So where the money that's put into infrastructure development, into roads, or into services, into regulations, whatever, can have such positive impact on the city that the benefits are sort of escalating. That is what we're interested in, and I have sort of called this the city of opportunity. So I will come back to that in a moment. I want to just show you some drawings that we made to try and visualize inequality in South Africa. So this is a portion of land. I don't know what you see in it, but we can see a national highway here. We see a secondary road. We see a railway line that does that. And we see a neighborhood, we see another neighborhood, some industrial area, etc. That is what is there. Now, let me show it to you in a different way. So this neighborhood was laid out during the time of apartheid, and it was designated for black South Africans. So this is a neighborhood that was seen as distinct from that neighborhood, and it was seen as distinct from that neighborhood. This one was classified black, that one was classified white, and this one was classified as mixed race. That's also mixed race, and that is industrial. Now, the convention that we developed for these drawings follows a suggestion of a German art critic called Irit Rogoff. And she made this comment that infrastructure can disconnect people as much as it can connect people. That's a very interesting notion. So what we said is, okay, if you have a highway through here, what we do as architects, we have the habit of drawing in the connection that exists, sort of following Nolly's map of Rome and that whole logic of showing streets and showing the connections, the pipes and everything. We're always concerned at illustrating the connection. So we thought, let us draw the disconnection. So if something is disconnected, we show it as disconnected. So we just make it black. So if this road serves to disconnect, then we show it as black. And within the South African context, these were what we call buffer zones. So it literally was made to disconnect this population from that population. So what else do we see here is that because it makes this island, it makes a periphery. So you can imagine the economic activity in this area is fairly limited. In here, somewhere in the center related to these lines are greater. Of course, that is. So I'm gonna leave this one at this, and I'm gonna show you a few others. So you begin to understand the legacy of this drawing. So here's another neighborhood. You see many of the same things, but this was not laid out during apartheid. This was laid out during the time of democracy. Okay, Nelson Mandela has big social change. We're now not doing what we did in the past. Human rights, constitution. So let's just see what this looks like. Wow, look at that. Look at this entire area that just serves to disconnect military air bases, highways, parliamentary villages with walls around them, etc. So we see that. I can maybe just say in these things, these dotted things, is that we show streets that's open to the public at all times as white and is controlled by the city as white. And every individual property we draw a different color so that we can just see literally how many owners there are, because we just want to see the number and the size of properties. So look at what happens here. One property given to one owner. Now what's significant about this, and these are all to scale, the drawings that I'll show you, is that this area is equivalent to the size of Cape Town, the old center city. That is 360 years old. So in 20 years, we built an area with about the same amount of floor space and retail space as the center of Cape Town. So we gave the right to one company to own an area the size of the center city, with the rights to develop office spaces, hotels, all of that, the size of the city, but one person owns it. So it's an extreme monopolization of economic opportunity, and the benefits of that accrues fundamentally to one person. So the fact that there are people renting from them is of course some secondary economic opportunity, but you have to negotiate that through one single entity, which is very, very significant. And we are very, very concerned that such rights are given. And I mean, for instance, if you look at this in planning terms, some of the same devices that was used during apartheid to separate people are repeated at the time of democracy. Now, we'd think a country that comes out of a political system that was called a crime against humanity will never repeat this separatist planning system again. And yet it happens, and it sort of happens without anybody noticing it, because it's shopping mall and so on. So it's not the same residential environments, but the idea of dividing people along economic lines rather than racial lines emerges here. Now, what is important is that South Africa and India liberalized the economy at exactly the same time, and the increase in inequality was immediate and is the same in both countries. So in a post-apartheid country, we have a pro-poor government, and yet the poor have a far worse fate, in spite of the government's absolute commitment to making the lives of the poor better. And the question is, how does it happen? And it's because of allowing things like this. Now, the reason why that is that these are some of the most expensive hotels, some of the most expensive shops, and most expensive office space. So by congregating this and monopolizing this, it desaturates the rest of the city of that economic opportunity and the capacity of the rest of the city to cope with the pressures that's on it without the money of the wealthy, because the money of the wealthy is now all gone somewhere else, is then substantially less. So I can show you, here's another drawing that we made of another part of this is the center of Cape Town, all to the same scale. So you see there's that portion. It took 360 years to develop. You can see the harbor has one portion like this that completely disconnects the city from the water. And there's another portion called the waterfront. You know, here's a big public park, quite the contrary. You can see how open something gets here. And you can see also how this network is really open to that. Okay, but so we started making lots of these drawings of various parts of the world. This is New York to exactly the same scale. And suddenly you can see how you have this extensive open network. And this, of course, is of particular interest to us. So we then developed this idea of the city of opportunity. So bear with me for 10 minutes. I want to just set out a scheme of ideas before I show you some of our work, and I can show you how this is relevant to us. But so the question is what to do in this kind of a situation. So first thing is to say is that this is an argument about undoing inequality. So this is the problem. Now there are other problems as well, but we have a particular interest in thinking about inequality and how to undo it. So to be specific, we are concerned about, we're concerned that cities produce inequality or exacerbate existing inequalities. So we had racial segregation, you have the caste system, so there's these inequalities that exist, and then suddenly we play into that. We are concerned that granting the privileges to monopolize economic opportunity to a minority is directly responsible for increasing poverty by restricting access to opportunity. So you must understand is that to turn around inequality, we have this perspective. So it is from this perspective that we're thinking. Okay. So the first point of reference is one that you might be very well familiar with, and that's Laurie Baker's comments about architecture for the poor. And he said that architecture for the poor must be the measure of all architecture. So he said he believed that if our conceptions of architecture can serve the poor, it could always serve the rich. So we say it the other way around. If our conceptions of architecture are aimed at serving the rich, they are not likely to be useful to the poor. So Baker's conception of an architecture for the poor is relevant here. In the context of radical urban privileges being given to the few and the negative externalities which flow from the exercise of these privileges, we must conclude that the dominant urban conception is urbanity for the rich. These drawings that we showed you of these big blocks of land of the city given to one owner is urbanity for the rich and the privileged. So urbanity for the poor is our point of departure here and not necessarily the ultimate goal. So you understand there's something about thinking from a certain point of view to antagonize a certain thing. But if we talk about architecture for the poor, I'm latching on to, if I'm talking about urbanity for the poor, I'm grafting this idea on Laurie Baker's idea of architecture for the poor. So the focus, let me go to the next one. The focus on urbanity for the poor, as Laurie Baker would say it, or as the fallist would say, the other 99%. You know, it sounds weird, but you know, in India's context, the other 99% owns the 40% of the country's wealth. You know, so the focus on this is about achieving urban equality. I do not think that an urbanity that serves the poor will necessarily work at all levels of the economy, but failure to create a city for the poor is ethically unjustifiable and politically divisive. A city for the rich limits the freedoms of the poor. Cities must allow entrepreneurs and businesses of all scales to thrive, and that is what we are looking at. City administrations have a constitutional duty to treat their citizens equally. Such equality in city administration means that cities have to work seriously through the consequences of development rights given to everyone, from the very rich to the very poor, because you can give rights to either of these two sides of the economy and limit the capacity of the other one to be free. So we're interested in both sides, but there's something about thinking it from the side of the least capable. So the first thing, and I'm not going to elaborate on this much, is this idea of Hannah Arendt, this right to have rights. You know, I'm just going to move along it. So there are two things that we're looking at. The one is movement, and the other one is rights. Now this sounds as like very, very simple ideas, but there's something about extrapolating the consequences of these ones. So let me talk about movement first. So participation in the benefits of city life is contingent on people's capacity to move through the city. This sounds very basic. We think everybody can move through the city, but I don't think it's always that easy. We can also say it the other way around. If anybody's movement is impaired by the design of the city, it substantially frustrates the participation in the city. Such impairment by design, of course, can happen at various scales. It can happen at the scale of a curb that prevents somebody from getting from the street onto the sidewalk, or it could happen at a metropolitan scale. So, two of my professors at University of Cape Town used to say that the measure of the city is a person on foot. We are, of course, also concerned about people in wheelchairs and people who cannot see. So when I talk about the person on foot, I'm paraphrasing an idea, but we try and give it an even broader sense today. So what Uitenboogaert and Dewar, who came up with this idea, so when they used the word measure, they referred to the size of, or the portion of the city that's accessible to people. So we could draw maps for every individual in the city that shows what's the size of the city that you have access to. Now that is very important, because we always think that the city is there and you're free to go wherever. But the question is, can everybody literally go anywhere, or is there a kind of a restriction that stops people from using the entire metropolis or using certain areas? Say, like your gender. I mean, we're not talking about a motorbike. We're talking about other things that maybe prevent you from using certain kinds of spaces. But Uitenboogaert also meant that the city can be judged by what it offers its most vulnerable citizens, or again, stated conversely, a city should be judged by what it denies people access to. If the least capable people are the measure of the city, then we can conclude that advancing freedom of movement is a fundamental task in advancing economic opportunity. This is I'm trying to take it from the rock bottom of ideas to say, let's check whether people can move in the city, because if that cannot happen, nothing else can happen. Okay, let's move to the next thing. Freedom of movement. In South Africa, the freedom of movement is a constitutional right. I understand that you don't necessarily have it as a constitutional right, but it's implied by Supreme Court comments. So, city design often restricts movement. So let me give you some ideas. Is that slavery, for instance, restricted movement. Now, we think that slavery is an abomination, but let's just see whether we are convinced that our cities don't repeat that today. So patriarchy restricts movement, and I think this is quite alive and well in India. Insecurity, to feel physically insecure, restricts movement. Apartheid in South Africa restricted movement, so a certain time of day, somebody of a certain race could not go into certain places. But the apartheid city was designed to restrict movement. And what is funny is that the city still does it. So design moves in the city that's aimed to restrict movement are incredibly durable. They last for decades and decades, and they exert their power, and that is why we are so concerned about new designs that restrict movement, because it could last for 100 years, and it could exercise its power, knowingly or unknowingly, for another 100 years. So we are, of course, very conscious of new barriers being designed into the city. Okay, so there's this idea of the person on foot as the primary measure, and then there's the right to move freely. Okay. If people's freedom of movement were increased, and if such movement occurs through continuous urban networks, the opportunity that an individual has access to increases. So a restricted city has less opportunity than a free city where the networks are more free. For the individual, the city becomes more useful, but to reduce barriers and advance interconnection in urban networks is not all that we can do. Government can assist in creating networks of opportunity by reinforcing urban networks with appropriate development rights, trading rights, entitlements, human densities, public transport, etc., etc. At the same time, big business have to stop advancing their interest at the cost of others. Later I will show you a project where we've indeed tried to do this. The spatial practices of big business can substantially assist in creating attractions for secondary and tertiary business. If the spatial practices of big business allow participation in their magnetism, it could create many business opportunities for others. So thinking about an architecture for the poor is one where we're saying is that there's a huge responsibility on the part of the wealthy about how they behave in the design of the city, because how they behave have a far greater effect on the future of the city than the way the poor behave in the city. If we want to transform a city that privileges a minority to a city of equal rights, we have to consider an alternative conception of the rights that all citizens have to the city. One of the most compelling conceptions of the rights that people should have to the city comes from David Harvey. I don't know if this is a well-known line here, but David Harvey said that the right to the city is not merely a right of access to what already exists, but the right to transform it to your heart's desire. Do you know this statement? It's an amazing, very short essay that he wrote, very, very powerful and very, it's a strong idea. Because on the one hand, he's thinking of a certain kind of a constituency when he's talking about this right to transform it. But if we have an idea, this idea must go for everybody, right? Because we're trying to be constitutional about this. So my question to David Harvey is that if he says that people must have the right to transform the city to their heart's desire, does he say monopoly capitalists also have the right to transform the city to their heart's desire? And I don't think so. The reality is that we think that we vote for government and we ask government, like with taxation, to act in the interest of the poor by curbing the behavior of the wealthy, in a way. You know, so in taxation you get cash from the wealthy, you give it to the poor in the dispensing of things for the common good. And the same has to do with this thing of the right to the city. So it's a very interesting thing, this idea that citizens should be able to participate. So again, this has to do with networks of opportunity and the right to movement. Okay, sorry, that was that one there. So that's the first right, this idea that you have the right to participate in your city. And we say, yes, people should have, but we should limit that in a way. We should think of where that idea then begins to collapse. The next idea that I think is very valuable is an idea that Amartya Sen came up with. I don't know, is he a well-known figure here? Nobel Prize-winning economist? Indian Nobel Prize-winning economist, one of the cleverest people ever lived. He studied the famine in India in 1947, and he asked himself, how did people die of hunger if there was enough food in the country to survive? Very difficult question to confront, and there's an economist looking at it. And what he came up with is this idea of entitlement. So he said basically you have two people who work in the fields. The one is an agricultural laborer, and the other one is a sharecropper. At the time of famine, the laborer dies because in spite of this person working on food, this person has no right to that food. But a sharecropper has a right to that food or an entitlement to that food and therefore survives. So let me apply Amartya Sen's idea to the current argument. To create a city of opportunity in the context of a history or a contemporary practice of marginalizing people, one has to acknowledge the entitlement that marginalized people have to the city. So this idea of David Harvey of the right to the city. So to say is that, you know, in a context like South Africa, where the system was called a crime against humanity, so the state is a criminal. So people then did all sorts of things to survive. Now they say settle illegally on land, and then 20 years later we want to tell people, you there illegally, you must go. But those citizens can say, but the state was the criminal. I just had to locate myself here in a way, and therefore I have an entitlement to the land. So to acknowledge that entitlement of citizens and non-citizens to economic, residential and social opportunities is the first step towards a city of opportunity. The next step would be to advance those rights. So one is to acknowledge that all citizens have access to the privilege of the city, and then we think, how can we advance that? So in the context of historic injustice and contemporary inequality, like both of our countries share, an obligation exists to reverse injustice. Because that is what we're talking about. If we are concerned about inequality, we must be concerned about reversing it. This can be done rapidly through revolution, people getting so fed up that they just go for it, which is a very real possibility in South Africa, maybe not in India, or gradually through some kind of transformation. So what's interesting, I don't know how well you know the South African story, but South Africa has chosen, particularly against revolution and for transformation, to achieve advancements of people's rights incrementally. So what's interesting is that our constitution states a Bill of Rights, but it also acknowledges that people's current experience of life does not conform to all of those rights, and that all organs of state and all bodies should work towards the advancement of those rights. It's a very interesting thing. So this idea that there's a goal and a process to constitutionality. So there was an essay written by a bunch called Urban Landmark, is that up there? Yeah. About incrementally advancing property rights. Now this is a very pragmatic idea in the context of limited resources. So programs of government should involve the incremental advancement of rights to achieve cities of opportunity. Now, timelines are very important in this, because if governments say that they will do it, but they take too long to achieve it, you inevitably just postponing revolution. But in acknowledging that situations are deficient, there's something in advancing those things in increments. Okay. And then the last idea, I think, is the idea of incremental advancement of people's rights to the city has some overlap with Amartya Sen's notion of the expansion of freedom. Amartya Sen argues that the expansion of freedom is viewed both as the primary end and the principal means of development. I don't know, are you guys familiar with this? There's a book called Development is Freedom, which I would strongly recommend you all read. That really talks about why one would develop a society into what end, The freedoms that he is concerned with involves access to food, job opportunities, education, healthcare, personal safety, the rights to vote, and so on. In his mind, these freedoms are interrelated. For example, the right to vote means very little if you feel unsafe to get to the polling booth, or you would say is that if you have limited access to economic opportunity, to healthcare, to schooling and so on, the right to vote is an empty freedom that you have. You can have it, but it doesn't mean much. It needs to be supported by other freedoms. So in other words, design, of course, cannot do it by itself. It needs to have other freedoms in society being advanced with that. So in short, what we are in search of is, can you at all read this? It's a city that is made up of a plethora of owners, people who have real rights to the economic opportunity that they're involved with, in a network of connectivity. So we're looking at this multitude of agents who have real agency, like the sharecropper, who have entitlement to what they're doing, and they can benefit directly themselves, as opposed to being laborers in a situation of benefit. But in a design format of connectivity. So that is what we are looking out for. And then finally, centuries of engineering logic has imparted the value of infrastructure developments to city. Infrastructure networks like water, electricity, sewage, telecommunication, and so on. I don't think that city governments are as focused on creating economic opportunity as they are in developing utility infrastructure. So I believe that the construction of opportunity is as important as the construction of infrastructure. And I think that this idea of antagonizing inequality means that there's a certain kind of a design that we are in pursuit of, and there's a certain kind of an end. So the expansion of freedom on the one hand, and this idea that we have to make sure that the city is laden with opportunity in order for people to survive, and it's economic, residential, socialization opportunity. Okay, I'm going to move on. So, whoops, I'm going to skip over this stuff. This is what we did in Goa. Okay. Oh, I'm going to skip also over this. This is the other research I told you about. I can maybe just very briefly tell you about this. I think there's some interest here. Is that we don't have the clients that we would like to work for. We get them every now and then. And while we don't have the clients we work for, we produce them in a way by working out what are the issues that we want to get involved with. And then we persuade people about that. And then we produce in a way good clients out of this. So one of this bits of research I've been doing for 7 years is to just try and understand how people live in Cape Town. How do they settle and what do they do? So I've been studying this neighborhood. It looks something like this, state subsidized housing and so on, where we've just seen what people are doing. So as an architect, I have no authorship here. I just look. And I try and be as unjudgmental as anything. I've been greatly inspired by what's called the McKinsey report. You know this? The man who studied human sexuality, who just asks people questions. And if you have sex with lots of women, he doesn't care. He just writes it down. And he got information that changed the world. So we are keen to just find out what people do. We don't care if they break the law and so on. We just want to know. We want to know if they break the law. But we're not obviously doing anything about it. And we're not talking to them about breaking the law. We want to see how people are living. So we have been looking at, this is a taxi stop, a big public transport hub. So we look at how it works, and we're particularly looking at, say, these shops that exist there. So this is a primary business, and this is a secondary business, and these ones are tertiary businesses. And we're looking at the interrelationship. Then here you find the secondary business. So the convention of this research is that we draw everything that's inside a space. If we can't get inside of it, it's denoted as dark. If we're inside there, we draw absolutely everything. It's full of tires or whatever, we draw it. We want to know where are people, so we draw human bodies as much as we draw artifacts, because we are interested in the use of space. And we're interested, say, in the socialization that happens in the door of this container, because that is a fairly permanent thing, and it's part of what makes life bearable and great for people. And we're interested in how tertiary businesses relate to secondary businesses and relate to the primary business of the taxi rank. We studied shebeens and taverns, places of alcohol sale. We asked ourselves the question of how is the public domain shaped by alcohol sales, and so on. Here, very interesting areas where this tavern builds walls to keep the crowds that sit here in the middle of the night from being against the walls and urinating against the walls of the houses. So they're mediating the public domain through all sorts of devices and so on. I can go on about this for a long time. We looked at daycare centers. We looked at rental housing. So we studied lots of these rental houses, 8 square meter houses that rent out per square meter the same cost as upmarket penthouses in the center of city. So, completely other economies that exist. And we studied public spaces. So this is a cul-de-sac that was formed by the planning, and then we look at how it's used, and say in this case how motor car repair is used here, and how the surface of it is filled with oil, and what that mean for a public space if you have a public space that's filled with oil, etc., etc. So I was talking about this earlier with the head of the school, is that we are interested in, I don't always write all the research, and that is because I'm a bad researcher. I can just confess to it. You must write. But so in the meantime, what we do is we organize exhibitions. So this was an exhibition we did at the Shenzhen Biennale. That was an animation that looks at individual houses. Now they change over time, so we animate that. And then we have the city there. So I can show you some of these animations. Look something like this, where we look at the structure. So this is a legal property set out, the water, the electricity, the roads, and then how people build this house and then change it. So how people add to it, and how this house becomes an apartment house. So we are concerned, for instance, at how all houses are businesses. So there's others where we're looking at shebeens or taverns, and how a house gets transformed. So we're trying to do more and more drawings where the dimension of time is shown in urban drawings. So because the problem is with a city, you draw it in one condition, but cities like ours, and I think like yours, change so fast that what you're drawing now is sort of irrelevant a few years later. And how do you reconcile that constant irrelevance of the drawing? So we're trying to find drawing devices through which we try and draw the city as we know it. So now the question is, you sit with all of these ideas, what do you do? So one day somebody comes to us and says, can you please build a business incubator? And it's a bunch of people who we didn't trust entirely. It's a waterfront in Cape Town. We were approached by a university to do a business incubator, but it's inside this very, very popular tourist destination. And they said it's a corporate social responsibility thing. Now those words turn me cold. Because I don't trust those motives. I don't trust philanthropists. This city has a great history of philanthropy. In our world, it's a very patronizing kind of a way, you know, in which you really don't engage, and it's like syntax, you know. So we tried to beat it out of them by just showing them the money. So we were asked, this is a big shed that was empty because it fitted very badly in the circulation of the city. There's a very popular aquarium on this side and very popular shopping mall on this side, and people literally walk here in the road past here. But because of the urban morphology, this thing just never worked. In 25 years of this whole area being this major tourist attraction, this building just never worked. So they asked us, can we put inside of this portion of the warehouse, can we just do an interior job and put a business incubator? And they said to us, on the end of it that faces the aquarium, we must put a place with really good coffee. Now, I don't know if this craze has hit India where people drink really good coffee, but I drink tea. And I don't think you make urbanity with great coffee. I think that we got to do more. So we basically thought that we will try and persuade them to change the brief and the site. So this is what we were asked to do. Here's the shed. That's the portion that never worked. This is the line of the pedestrians around. There's a big dry dock next to it, and this is the ocean and the harbor wall here. So we basically were asked to do an interior job, and we thought, why don't we do the opposite? Make an exterior as opposed to making an interior. Now, you come from a place where a lot of things are open. I come from a place where the wind blows you off your feet. We have photos of people holding on to masts, you know, with the wind blowing them over, or the buses being blown over in the wind. The wind is very serious. So we make enclosed buildings. So to make an exterior in our climate is counterintuitive, and it's not a tropical climate either. But so what we said to them is that instead of trying to make this internal thing that is great and make urbanity with good coffee, why don't we just make a street right through the building? So we asked, could we use this other side of the building where there were other tenants in there? And can we just go and make a street that just connects? So instead of making a building, we make a network. So, and what we said to them is, this business incubator that you want to make, why don't we fly that over this? Now, I said to you is that the city shape has a lot to do with how big business behaves. So we thought, if this is a business school of a university who wants to do a business incubator, certainly the university should have some degree of leadership to show people how the city should be made, and certainly how the city that results from this business incubator that you make must demonstrate the way forward for the city. I can tell you the client had no such conception, but we basically laid these words in their mouth. So what we said is that, for one, a university-based business incubator has no business being on the ground floor. And two is that if you're so damn good at stimulating business, why don't you just do that? So why don't you go and stimulate business? So you show people how you can, by what you're doing, stimulate business, and then you find the right relationship of your building relative to that. And also in representational terms, we said, instead of making a facade that represents how great you are, that has this appearance, that is the traditional way of a university building, why don't we undermine this propensity to create an appearance and rather create a performance? So this university building is known by the underside of it. Now, very few buildings are known by their undersides, but the underside of this accommodates a market underneath, and it creates a whole lot of business for small businesses. And this is the link with that research that I showed you before. So there we looked at where businesses do really well and how big they are. So we're measuring these things up, 1 square meter shops, 2 square meter shops. This is very common here, but not that common in South Africa. And the wealthy who make decisions are largely not familiar with that pattern of urbanization, and therefore they don't know how to do it. So this is the network that we set up. There's the building, and there's a series of networks that then begin to work through this building. So this is the reflected ceiling plan. You can see we hovered. This is the business incubator, which is a steel grid of 50 by 50 meters that we're hovering over this market. And on the sides, we made space for expansion, both of the market activity and of the business incubator. In South Africa, if people approach you for a building and they say 1,000 square meters, they always want you to make it 1,000 square meters. And if you want to make it bigger, they say you want to push up your fees. So I always say to him, what's going to happen if you are successful? You've just set up this business incubator. What happens if you're successful? Do you just leave the building in a year? Because that undermines this architecture in a way, because the patron is not there anymore. So we said to him, build additional spaces on the side that can be there for the growth. 1 year later, they occupied all of it. And then, in addition to this, we try and make some diverse spaces. So we made these internal gardens here, and we made some other shops. So what we said to him, the kind of urbanity that we propose is one that is diverse in its extent. So in other words, it's not just a business incubator. It's shops, it's offices, it's recreational spaces like parks, and then a big events venue. So people come there for different reasons. So this is the section. Here's the hovering floor. It doesn't have a single column. It hangs literally off the roof. There's the exhibition venue, and there's another space for the exhibition venue. But significantly, there's a wall there that we also thought can disappear, and then this incubator can expand out there. And I'm very happy we've just been appointed to take down that wall and expand the business incubator in there. This is a section through the park, and you can see there's these grand steps coming up to this viewing platform because the dry dock is over this side. And that's just where you see this sort of smaller section. So what we did is, in order to make sure that people think of this building as an urbanity as opposed to architecture, we fiddled with the representational devices of architecture. So in other words, I undermine my own architecture by making it look like furniture. So let me show you. So this is a building. Okay, this is easy, slabs, columns, and so on. But I want to show you. Okay, I'll come back to it. I'll show you these photos first. So you can see here's the dry dock, and you can see here's the entrance. We have very, very severe wind where I come from. So this corner here might look like a bit of a capricious corner, but it's a wind pocket. So we designed pockets outside doors that it gobbles up the wind, and there's the release of it. So there's a whole system of wind design to make sure that the wind doesn't come inside here. And here's the street that we made right through the building. There's the hovering floor at the back. And there's a roof light that basically articulates the street just going straight through. And I'll talk to you about these things. It's like buildings, and these things, it's like furniture in a moment. So this was the basic building. So the outside of the building, we hardly changed. We made a whole lot of light, but we tried to focus on its inside. So this is the floor that we introduced inside, and all of these drawings I'm going to show you to the same scale. That is in essence what we were appointed to do, the business incubator. So this portion we think of as permanent, so it's a complex hanging structure, steel structure. And then adjacent to it, the fire escapes, which is also pretty permanent. Those things generally don't move about. And these expansion spaces, which are 2 floors of concrete. Then we made these little shops that you saw a moment ago. This is to the same level, but we make it out of timber, which is an unusual way of building in South Africa. And we make it very much like a piece of furniture, but it entirely is like a building. So it has its own roof, and it has its own facade, and so on. Then we make another piece that's much more just like a facade, but it has just furniture components at the back. Then we make this wall with extensions. We make this little cupboard, and then we make this little thing. That's all to scale. Now you can imagine if this thing gets lost, was painted pink, nothing changes. So that thing could be lost and painted pink. So we can go up on the scales. So what we do is we try to focus on this idea that this street is more important than the buildings by not making the buildings look like they're durable. So make them look like you can take them down and you can change them. So I know I was teaching in Zurich at the time, and I got this phone call from the office. The building is a week old, and they said, they are painting everything, they're changing things, they're taking things down. I said, well, fantastic, what's the problem, you know? So this is basically what happens. There's the smallest part that we did. You can imagine if that gets lost, it really doesn't change anything. So here's these shelves that we designed, and you know, this was when it was new, so some of them have been painted black already, and this keeps on changing. But the floor, this is the old workshop floor, we never changed. So the street, we actually never physically designed any fabric. We just designed the rules of inhabiting this thing. So here's the big floating floor, and you look through these holes at the business incubator that's up above. And here you can see there's a 4 square meter tenancy. There's another 4 square meter tenancy, tiny, tiny shops. And there you can see a 2 square meter tenancy. And the 2 square meter tenancy pays more than Louis Vuitton in the same area per square meter. And they make so much money out of them that they just want more and more and more of them. And yes, part of these garden spaces, we have actually advanced this in the meantime. And there's the big stair going up to the viewing deck. So you can see there's something about mixing this thing as purely commercial, purely institutional, not just offices. So the diversity of functions, the diversity of human actions, and the density of human actions for us is what the urbanity is about. So this is the business incubator on the upper level, and you can see down to this market. So not only do we want this business incubator to facilitate these business opportunities below it, but there's something in a reciprocity between the two things. So you're sitting here coming up with an idea in a more academic kind of a context, and you're looking down at somebody who's selling ostrich eggs. And you might think, what a ridiculous thing to sell. But every day you watch this guy selling one after the next, after the next, after the next, and you see his fancy car and everything. And you suddenly realize, well, what does it mean, to do something? That the pragmatism of what somebody does there might influence somebody. But in the reverse, somebody might be doing stuff here and then looking at some of the more innovative theoretical stuff that's being done and say, I'm going to join up there, I want to join that program. So you can see here that the ceiling, that is the floating floor, this building has almost no substance, it's just glass. In our context like yours, it's very hot, you can never do it, well, except if you do it underneath this thing. This is a complete outdoor space, which in South Africa, it is absolutely common. You might think, oh, so what? This is an absolute revolution in South Africa. People could not believe that we could not put a door on this building. It's very European in that sense, is that people always think that you're going to close it in the end. But you can see the building denies its own appearance in favor of this grid and lights that's on the underside, so what it makes possible underneath it. So I'm just going to very quickly show you this. There might be the most Okay, I'm going to move along. I want to show you a completely different kind of a project. This is a house that we did in a very mountainous area. This is sort of what the site looks like. The site is very prone to burning down. We have natural fires that occur all the time. There are many, many baboons, so the house had to be baboon-proof. And the client asked us if we don't mind to make it invisible, because he climbs the mountain and doesn't want to see his house when he's on top of the mountain. I don't know if you can see the house. There it is. So we had to find a way of making this thing melt into the landscape and finding some visual similarity with the context around it. So we work on Revit. I don't know if you guys work on Revit. You take the contours. This is 400 square kilometers. We put it into it. The farm is there. And it looks like the green hills of Ireland or something. It has no rocks and certainly doesn't have the vegetation. So now we sit in the office and we think, how do we see this building at all? So we developed this thing where we take laser scanners and we scan the environment. I don't know if this is a familiar technology here, where we scan everything, the rocks and the plants. It makes a thing called a point cloud. Millions of little points where we can feed it into the 3D program, and I can see the leaves and the twigs and the rocks and everything, and I know exactly what I'm doing. So, by the time we were done, we could do this kind of animation, seeing exactly the building in the context with the exact plants and the exact rocks. None of this is an artistic interpretation. This is pure matter of fact, where we can see what the landscape is looking like. So this site plan accurately shows all the rocks, and we could get proximity to the rocks in a way in which it's quite tight without cutting down these valuable trees that surround it, and without having to destroy the rocks because you just didn't know that they're there. We know exactly where they are. So what we did, because this is an area of incredible biodiversity, is we asked a botanist to help us know where to build it. And he identified a spot where he said the rocks are very close to the surface and you don't have very complex plant life. So we built on top of the rocks. And we built this house that's basically a series of 3 buildings with a common space in between them. This is a very, very cheap house, by the way. And I don't know if you can see it, but the rocks are right here below the surface, and we built on the surface. And what we did is to add a second skin of brickwork to the building to try and conceal anything that gives you scale. So downpipes, sewage pipes, windows, all of those sorts of things. And we made the openings outside bigger than the openings inside to mess with your sense of scale so that it diminuates the building. And then we made some volumes bigger and smaller so that it sort of has some visual similarity with the rocks that it sits on. The roof is made out of exactly the same material as the walls. So it's concrete bricks made out of recycled concrete, and the bricks on the roof and on the walls everywhere. On the floors, everything's made out of the same material. And that's how it sits in the landscape. And that's what the openings are like. These rocks are exactly this color if you break them, but the lichens and stuff that grow on it will grow over these things. We poured yogurt over the building so that it grows faster. And this is basically what the opening is like. That's my wife, by the way. My business partner also. And that is just a short movie showing you, in some ways, what we did. You can see this was very much part of producing a foreground, like in Japanese gardens. This idea that you construct the view through the way you make the building is a very important thing. We're running out of time, so I'm going to skip this school that we did. This school we did a few years ago. You might know this building. I want to move on to another school that we've done. Okay, this is a school that we're busy building at the moment, and it was another discussion I had today just about Fumiko Maki and the social structures theory. But this is a school, we've done a fair amount of public schools. We like working for government. We like doing public projects because they have a kind of a social purpose that just comes with them. But this is a school for kids with special educational needs. So they have kids from 3 years old to 18 years old with severe mental handicap or with autism, and so on, all in the same school. So for the different age groups, we made these different blocks as part of the educational system. So there's 4 blocks, and each one of them contain a collective space in between them. This is the administration block. So the question was, at this urban scale, how do you make a big courtyard that begins to connect to this park across the road, and this big platform that enjoys this view here? And how do you build a kind of a social structure to the architecture? We have a whole group of people, kids that must come and play outside. Now these kids are prone to respiratory diseases, so in our high wind they get sick easily and they stay away from school for 3 months, and then their development is seriously impaired. Or you have kids who run, they get a crazy idea in their head and they just start running. And you have the teachers who have to run behind them. So you can imagine an 18-year-old man, a body of a man, a mind of a child beginning to run, and the teachers are having to bolt after this man to catch him. So the courtyards try and contain them. It does contain them, but our brief asked for corridors, and we didn't really want to make corridors because we thought that that in no way can hold people in a social manner. So this is a recent aerial photograph. The building is still under construction, but you can see these are the banks of classrooms on either side, and in the middle is the social spaces that we made out of timber construction. Here's a big hall, and there's some workshops here, but the entry to the school is over here, and then there's a sort of a circular drop-off so that the kids are always dropped off on the left-hand side, because they don't think properly when they get out of cars, so that they are safe when they get out of cars, and you can keep on dropping them out of left-hand side and you can come out. And this is the administration building, and there's a sports field up there. So this is the section that we devised, where you basically have classrooms here, with roof lights on the side, then another roof light that's on the outside, so that whatever heat is generated here goes straight out. and the roof lights, the heat burden on it is substantially reduced. And there's a series of baffles because these kids are very sensitive to light contrast. So we're trying to blur the light as much as we can. Then we build a lot of models. I was in Doshi's office this morning and was telling a whole lot of people that they must build big models and so on. And we do these models. This one, you can put your face in that triangle. That's how big it is. And we replicate everything, including constructional details. If you look very, very carefully, you can see the bolts and everything that we can replicate the light. Because we find is that even with sophisticated computer software, you cannot replicate light, and the only way you can do it is through a model that you put in the sun, and then you know what you're going to get. So this is the building is under construction, as I said, and this is how it's coming out. So you have classrooms on either side, and then this collective space between them. So you're seeing the next group's one, and there's this divider where you then have to go out to the common courtyard. But this means that even if you have rain and wind and so on, they can have art classes out here, they can play outside, and they have a lot of teaching that deals with outside, because the kids have impairment in walking sometimes. It's part of intellectual disability. So they paint lines on the road and they let kids walk along the lines or cycle along a line or make a pedestrian crossing or those sorts of things. Or for the older kids, they replicate a restaurant situation with umbrellas and food preparation. So they teach kids to serve food or to cut up food and those sorts of things. So it replicates the sort of spaces of the city in a way in there. These are acoustic panels, just that the sound doesn't get too much inside there. And this is the hall, so we get our soft light from the south side, you get your direct light from the south, we get direct light from the north, this side. So we made this roof light here where the light just comes down this big curve, and you have very, very gentle light, and then another window on the side there, another window there, that we try and get the light as even as we can throughout the entire hall. And these are perforated. These are perforated bricks we turn on their side to make acoustic panels. And the last building I'll show you, you might have seen this. It was in the Architectural Review 3 months ago. This is a hospital that we finished. We didn't do any of this, by the way. So this is a project, I could imagine this could happen in India as well, is that you get a government project like this and almost everything is wrong. You know, you almost can't tell it to the client because then they think you're just so negative about everything. But every move that was made in the planning is the wrong decision. So they did a new extension to the hospital, and these things are dead-ended. In other words, there's a corridor inside, but you cannot extend out here. So they ask us to extend, but you cannot extend the hospital. And we literally had to break down everything in this area. Yeah, I mean, this had to be broken down, but you can see this new electricity hub, a new gas bank, all of these things, all this primary infrastructure, water tank, all of them are in the wrong position. To add insult to injury, this site is crisscrossed with services like this everywhere. 50 years, people put in services and they don't have a single drawing to say where it is. So we had to do like mine excavation, work across this thing by hand pick, just find the services, because you've got to disconnect them all. This is a hospital. You don't just turn down the tap and see who dies. You know, you first replace the pipe, take the pipe away. So it will not surprise you. This is my 11th year on this job. We've got 2 to go and then we'll be done. But so this is the project that we inherited, and this is what we are proposing to try and create some order. So first of all, introduce a ring road that organizes the traffic, make it a one-way road so that we can make it nice and tight, and that we can produce urban conditions. So building on this side of the road, building on this side of the road, same here, same there. So a series of courtyards, like parking courts, along the hillside, and then structure it. So the front door of the hospital is there, and you go through and you find a pediatric ward, theaters, laboratories, kitchens, refuse areas, bulk stores, administration building, staff residence, all sorts of buildings. So this architecture of equality has been in our mind for a long time. So in hospitals in South Africa, I think it's not unlike India, where there's this in the English terms, class divide, but the spaces it's made for the surgeons are always substantially better than the spaces it's made for the cleaner. Is it like this in India? It's just disgusting. I do not know how the state can be part to this. Because if you have a constitution, all citizens are the same, how can you make different kinds of spaces for people who are paid differently? I can understand that you can pay people differently, but I cannot understand that they have different spaces. So we tried to find an architecture that instills an equality. And what we came up with is this roof to the hospital. It's just the same, you know, the kitchens over here, cleaner spaces over here, storerooms are over there, the workshops are over there, surgical areas over there. You just can't see. So one is that the building treats people equally. And secondly is, like with many of our clients, they just can't make up their mind as to what the brief is. So you're designing this thing 2 years down the line and the brief keeps on changing. And one day I just had enough and I thought, what do we do? You know, I've got to design this building. We are appointed, they're paying us fees and they're paying us for redesign, but I want to get on with it. What are we going to do? So I thought, okay, what kind of building do you design where you don't know what's going to be in it? So I thought a shopping mall. I did my thesis now to destroy shopping malls, by the way. So I thought, okay, a shopping mall, you build a big shell and then you show where the light is and the rest you leave to other people. And they can just do it and you kind of can't get it wrong because the light orders the whole space. So we thought we would do exactly the same. So this is what the plan looks like. It's just a warren of things. There are corridors that's perpendicular to the light. I'll talk about this in a moment again. But the floors have vinyl. There's nothing you can do about this. The walls are full of equipment. There's nothing you can do about that. And they're going to change them all the way around, before, during, after, whatever. So you don't even know where the walls are. So what do you have as an architect to work with? You just have the ceiling. So the logic was that we design a module like this that conforms to a typical hospital ward. We can have 2 beds on either side and we can bring light in between. And we developed this system of basically it's like triple glazed, except it only has glass on the outside, that lets through the light, and then the heat inside this pocket gets ventilated out because it has ventilators. So we ventilate from the gutters underneath the corrugated iron, and there are a set of ventilators there to take out all the heat that develops there. The glass cuts out some of it, it cuts out 40% of it, but it's still not enough. So then there's a polycarbonate panel that's ribbed, and when the light comes straight down like this, it begins to shade it. But these boards are polystyrene boards. You call it something else. You know what polystyrene is? There's another name for it. Yeah, I can't remember. But it's like the white beads, but not that one. The one that's extruded. Yeah, but then we face this with foil. So it's basically very light insulation material. We've put real aluminium foil over it, and we build it like gigantic brick. And this thing acts as reflectors because it's both here and there on the side. So if the sun shines like this, it bounces around on this thing and it eventually comes down. And then there's another acrylic diffuser there that helps spread the light. So what you do is you basically separate heat from light in the way that the thing comes in so that the interior of the hospital is naturally lit. Now this sounds very basic, but I mean, I can't tell you how many great buildings I've seen in Ahmedabad that's actually unnaturally dark on the inside, including buildings on this campus, where it's intolerably dark in certain places. So in hospitals, you always have very deep plans where the light comes into the end and then it gets dark into the middle, and people just put on fluorescent lights, and you have people who work for 30 years under fluorescent light. And that's really terrible. There's medical research to prove that people hate their jobs, they want to resign all the time, they become suicidal, everything. So the idea is to get natural light in so that the building has a nice feeling. So this is basically the system, a deep wooden truss, very simple construction, that's deep enough so that you can get a 450 millimeter air conditioning pipe. And it has a correlation with the main service duct, so the electrics always goes there and there, and mechanical services always go there and there. And you basically comb the services in the building that you know where they are. You take out a panel there, you know you're going to get electricity. You take out a panel there, you know you're going to get mechanical services, where usually they just put them anywhere, and the building turns into garbage over time. So the first one was the pediatric ward. This is the kitchen, you know, and we spent forever designing the kitchen. We made many enemies designing the kitchen until this kitchen was absolutely nice, because we wanted the windows that when you work in the kitchen you can look out. So even from the back of the kitchen you can look out and you can have the same view. And there's the kitchen today. You know, this was just when they moved in, and you can see how this natural light system is working. You can see the lights are not on, and the space is naturally lit, and you can work here and you have a view out. These are the corridors. Now what we did in this thing is that we ran the corridors perpendicular to this undulation, because in a lot of hospitals they run the services over the corridors because they think that's the only place to service where you can get access to it outside of clinical spaces. But then you get these long continuous corridors, and they put fluorescent lights, and you push somebody on a trolley and they get epileptic fits underneath it. So there's something about the design of hospital ceilings and corridors. You can't expose the lights because you give people epileptic fits. So we just said, but the problem is that these corridors very often get quite long, and they have to be straight. There's lots of reasons in South Africa why it has to be like this. But so you have the 7.5 meter undulation that just does this, and then suddenly a very long corridor just becomes 5 bays. And as a system, it's not so much, and you can say break it with that entry piece where you see there's just more light coming in and the next moment happening there. So this is just when they opened, before the cars started parking here. That's the administration building. This is the corner of the administration building, very basic offices, but then just using the fire escapes to give some drama to it. And then a courtyard made in this triangular space here. You can see the trees have been planted, but they've got to get big to just grow out over this thing, but to grow out in front of this building. And this landscape will be full of indigenous vegetation. But this provides security, because in South Africa security is a big deal. So this is 2.2 meters high, so that people can't climb in there, and staff can work here at night and leave the doors open. That's basically what it looks like. And that is it. Thank you very much.